My name is Bonnie Garcia-Glockner. I'm the Associate Director for the Office of National Fellowships. We also have Dr. Kate McCall, the Acting Director for the Office of Graduate Fellowships and Awards, and Ting E. Liu from the Program Coordinator for the Office of National Fellowships. So we are all part of your advising team if you're interested in applying to Boren. We are very, very fortunate today to have Sarah Chow here to talk about the Boren Award. Who's been working with Boren for 7 years.
Something like that.
Yeah, so well versed, and we're very, very excited. We're going to give this presentation. So enjoy.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your afternoon to listen to me speak for an hour about the Board Awards. As Bonnie mentioned, my name is Sarah Chow. I work for IIE, who is the organization that administers the Board Awards. I've worked with Boren, like she said, since about 2018, so I guess that is 7 years. I do a lot of outreach, but my specific role is I oversee the application and the selection process. So what that means is that as I go through this outreach presentation, I tend to circle it back into how you can make a strong application, which can be very good, but also I can get in the weeds sometimes. So I am still pretty hurt. But again, thank you so much for being here. Just really quickly, how many of you are undergraduate students? How many of you are graduate students? Okay, great. Right, and how many of you guys, I'm assuming you guys have heard of the Boren Awards, you have some idea of what it is. Okay, great. So I'm still gonna start from the very beginning. So the Boren Awards, what are we? It is a scholarship and fellowship. Usually how I like to start these presentations are with my version of an elevator pitch, which is actually a little bit boring, but it encapsulates what Boren is. And what we are is we're a federally funded scholarship and fellowship. And what our goal is we want to give US students the opportunity to spend a longer time studying abroad, studying a language.
Sorry, I did that.
I was like, I didn't know. But yeah, the idea is we want to give students the opportunity to study for a longer time abroad, so they can really kind of immerse themselves in studying a language intensely, and kind of marinating themselves in the language and culture of a country that is deemed critical to US national security. Another way of putting that is countries that are kind of off the beaten path. Language, culture, service, and national security, those are the pillars of Boren. 3 of them are our logo, and the national security is the 4th pillar that doesn't fit in our logo, basically. But I'll be coming back to those, one of those points throughout this presentation. As I mentioned, it's a federally funded award. It is funded by the Department of Defense. Within the Department of Defense, it is a Defense Language and National Security Education Office initiative. Otherwise known as Delencio, because even Delencio is a mouthful. And it's administered by IE, which is what. So this first slide is just a little bit of background about what the Boren Awards is. It was created in 1991 by the National Security Education Act. And what it is, it's generous funding for for students to be able to study abroad, specifically for students who want to study a language abroad. So in that way, it's a little bit of a throwback because we're wanting people to go abroad for longer term, really studying a language, as opposed to just like a J term or just like a winter term or something like that. It's also specifically for students who are committed to both studying languages and are also interested in public service in the federal government, because as part of receiving the award, you do agree to work for the federal government for a year after you graduate. And this is, as you can see, it's a pretty generous award. As I mentioned earlier, it's about really kind of, we want students to be able to study long term and really study language and immerse themselves in culture. What's the best way to study language? It's to be there for as long as possible. So we do have a preference for a duration of study, and that is for the 25 to 52 weeks. That is our preferred length of study. That's what we consider a year. if you do the math, 25 weeks is actually 6 months. But for Boren, for all intents and purposes, for Boren's, it's considered a year. You go abroad for a year, you get $25,000 to fund your program. The minimum amount of time you can go abroad is, if your period is 12 weeks, so you go abroad for a semester. For 12 to 24 weeks, you get $12,500. If you're an undergraduate student who is also a STEM major, we do have special eligibility for you because we understand that it can be difficult to get away when you've got your STEM major. For STEM majors at the undergraduate level, you just go abroad for the summer for 8 to 11 weeks, you can receive $8,000. For graduate students, the same scenario, 25, 12.5. We do not have that summer STEM eligibility, but for graduate students, you can do a domestic summer program before you go abroad and get that $5,000. So in total, you would get an up to $30,000 if you're doing a year and then the semester. I will mention preferences. We have several different preferences. For duration of study, ours is a year. If you ever don't meet one of the preferences, that's fine, you can still apply. It's just as part of your application, you would want to explain why you're not doing what Boren prefers. So in this instance, if you're can only go for a semester because of X, Y, Z reason, that's fine. You'll just kind of want to mention that. That's why you're not going for the full preferred. Yeah. One note about the award. So one great thing that we've done, I think it was like 3 years ago now, is you get the full amount, basically. So if you're going abroad at any time frame between 25 weeks to 52 weeks, you get the full $25,000. If you're going abroad for 12 weeks, 15 weeks, 23 weeks, you get $12,500. The catch to it is that you have to use your Boren award for Boren eligible costs. This is a list of the things that Boren covers. Things that it doesn't cover are things like passports, vaccinations, personal travel, your rent back in the US, car payment back in the US, things like that. You can also stack awards. So if any of you guys are interested in or have heard of the CLS award, Critical Language Scholarship, or even like Gilman or something like that, you can use both awards to pay for your overseas program. You just can't do what we call double dipping. Basically, that means you can't use the same 2 awards to pay for the same aspect of the program. If you have questions, I can answer that over there. But it is a pretty generous award. It does cover, especially because it's in areas of the world that are deemed critical to U.S. national security. It'll usually it'll go pretty far. Like if you're going to study in Australia for a year, $25,000 is not going to cover it. Australia is also not eligible for the Boren. But if you're planning to study in, like, say, Cambodia, it's going to go pretty far for a year. Where in Cambodia is eligible. Who is it for? You have to be a U.S. citizen. It's for students who are interested in studying a foreign language intensively in an eligible world region. Again, eligible world region is countries deemed critical to U.S. national security, aka kind of off the beaten path. So basically, what's not eligible is Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and the U.S. Can't do domestic. You should be committed to public service and to national security, again, because we have that that federal service requirement after you graduate. You need to be matriculated at a U.S. institution, so I assume you will be matriculated at FSU, we've got that FSU. What that means is you can't use Boren to do like a traditional gap year program, because you have to kind of maintain your tether, maintain your enrollment as a degree seeking student here at FSU. I mentioned you have to be a U.S. citizen. You also cannot be a citizen of the country where you are studying. Can be a dual citizen, that's awesome, I'm very jealous. It's just, for instance, if you were a U.S. citizen and a Colombian citizen, you couldn't apply. You couldn't use the Boren to study in Colombia. You have to use it to study anywhere else. All right. That is a QR code where you can see all this information. All right, so I had mentioned earlier that Boren has several preferences. One is duration of study. The other preference we have is for specific destinations, countries that can go to university. I also mentioned that Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Canada are not eligible. Those are the countries in gray. On the Boren website, the preferred countries are listed. So they're not listed here. So if you're really good at geography, you can tell, but you don't have to be. So what the colors mean are if it's green or blue, those are what we call preferred countries. I mentioned earlier, our preferred duration of the year. Our preferred countries are these ones listed in green. Green is good to go, absolutely fully intended students there. Countries in blue are preferred, but on that website, there will be an asterisk next to them. So we call them our asterisk countries. What that means is we haven't sent students there in the last year or so, and we don't anticipate being able to send students there this coming cycle. And it's the usual suspects, right? Like Russia, Ukraine, Venezuela, DRC, Nigeria, things like that. So Ukraine, we're not really students. You can apply to countries that are asterisk countries in blue. But as part of the application, you would have to put in an alternate country. We can still study that same language. And note on that, in addition to asterisk countries, we have asterisk languages, which are Arabic, Mandarin, and Russian. Those are languages that are spoken in multiple countries. We started doing this during COVID when everyone was just going all sorts of places. And we've kind of kept it up. And the idea is that if you're applying for an asterisk language, you also need to put a backup country who can speak that language. The difference between an asterisk country and an asterisk language is that if you apply to study Russian in Russia, we will most likely, I don't foresee the relationship between the US and Russia improving. I don't anticipate us seeing Russia as that kind of thing. However, if you apply to study Russia and Kazakhstan, you still need to put a backup country. However, we would, as far as I foresee, we will be sending students to Kazakhstan, that kind of thing. Can't see the future, who knows what will happen, but that's just kind of the difference between the two. Lastly, the countries that are yellow, those are countries that are eligible, but they're not on Boren's preferred list. You can apply to one of those countries, but similar to, again, like I said, if you're going for, you're not meeting our preferred duration of study, you want to explain why. If you're not meeting one of our preferred destinations, you want to explain why. And how you explain why it's important, critical to US national security, should need to go to this country. An example we always use off the top of our head is say like it's eligible but not preferred. However, it's smack dab in between Russia and China, two massive world powers with a relative antagonistic relationship to the US. You could probably figure out some kind of national security for sure. So in addition to duration, and in addition to destination, we also have preferred language. If you guys are familiar with the critical language scholarship, all of those languages are also preferred for Boren, but we have a whole bunch of other. And they kind of correspond to really the countries that are preferred. But one of the things I like best about Boren, and I think is the neatest thing about Boren, is with the exception of French and Spanish, Boren has no minimum proficiency requirement, nor do we have a maximum proficiency requirement. So again, with the exception of French and Spanish, if you're interested in studying Slovak and you've never done that before, that's fine. True beginners can and do receive. Couple of notes, French is only preferred if you study it through the African Language Initiatives program, or the AFIS program. But if in that, I'll look back to that. Only preferred through AFLI, it is one of the two languages that has a minimum proficiency requirement. The minimum proficiency is intermediate high. Spanish is the other language that has a minimum proficiency requirement. It's very exciting because it used to be that the minimum proficiency was advanced. This year we lowered it to intermediate high. It is still not preferred language, but you'll notice that there are, how will come? Because there's lots of preferred countries where you speak Spanish. And the reason for that is, the reason why Spanish is preferred is because it's quite widely spoken, relatively widely spoken within the government already, and it's quite widely spoken in the US. So again, as with the other, if you decide to do something else that was not a preference, you can absolutely apply for it. It's just you need to explain why it's important for you to go from Boren to pay for you to go someplace in Spanish. But it can be done, right? Like if you have to get an intermediate high level and you're like, I want to become a doctor. And so I have already made arrangements to work with a clinic down in Argentina. So I'll really be focusing on like medical Spanish jargon or what have you. But I can't get one here, something like that. Like it's a specific reason why you're going down there, not just like studying Spanish literature. But that's exciting. So Spanish is hopefully that lowers the barrier. We have more Spanish speakers. That said, though, by far, if you want to study in Latin America, by far, what most people do is they study Portuguese in Brazil. And if you're anything, I'm from Texas, I know a lot of people who study Spanish, and everyone I know who studied Spanish now wants to learn Portuguese. So I assume it's the same everywhere. And that can be a good kind of part. So you're learning with the Spanish background, but now I really want to learn Portuguese because it's going to help me be familiar with the entire culture of Latin America. One other thing, you've mentioned a handful of African indigenous languages on this list, but every single African indigenous language is preferred. You just don't list them all because there's a lot. Spanish, great. And the last preference we have is for field of study. For those of you who are STEM majors, this is in green. That's what we consider our preferred STEM majors. In white are the majors that we are considered for preferences. We give a set list of majors. If your major doesn't fit exactly within one of these, just pick the one that's closest. Then absolutely no time debating over it. Like if you're a biochemistry major, spend no more than a second thinking if you should choose biotechnology or chemistry. Like it's fine. We'll see your transcript. The idea though is as part of national security, for the first essay, you want to talk about your national, why this country and language is critical to U.S. national security. You want to base that argument based on what you studied and what you'd like to do. So this is kind of, it's not just people who are studying, it is for people who are studying languages, but you don't have to be a language major. Again, because there's no proficiency requirement, but if you're a political science major, an absolute preferred major, it's something that Boren is for you. Anyone here an ROTC or a veteran? Right. So if you're an ROTC on track to commission, serving in the armed forces counts as your service. So you have a slightly higher, like a preference for veterans, which is a slightly higher acceptance rate for ROTC and veterans. You still have to make, your various arguments, but oftentimes you're more familiar with things, different things that you can do with them. All right. There's three types of ways you can use it. There's a self-identified program. There's a regional flagship language initiatives, which is AFLI and FEFLI, right? That I mentioned AFLI earlier with Pen in it. We'll get to that in a second. And then we have this new Masters of Professional Studies Persian. Anyone here studying Persian? All right, I will skip over that. So let's first talk about these self-identified program structure. Otherwise called choose your own adventure option. You might hear us called more free range Boren. That is by far the vast majority of students use the Boren for. You decide you want to go abroad, find a way to pay for it. Boren is a funding stream to help pay for your program. In that scenario, again, we're focused on what you guys studying for a long time, what you guys studying language intensively while you're there. So we do have a minimum of 50 to 20 hours of language study per week. That's not necessarily contact hours classroom, but we want you studying, that's like the minimum. Our after program, our fleet program, to like in a second, they study like 60 hours per week. That's the gold standard. Want to kind of be in there, basically, the more the better. One of the other really cool things about Boren, so I had said earlier that the Boren doesn't have a minimum proficiency requirement or a maximum proficiency requirement. Another neat thing about Boren is that we don't require that you receive credit while you're abroad. You do have to maintain your matriculation here at FSU, so FSU would require that you receive credit, but we don't require it. But what that means is, as long as there's an intensive language component to it, we'll fund it. So we will fund your traditional Florida State University affiliated program, maybe FSU in Jordan, if that exists, we would fund that. But we'll also fund things like private tutoring, or if you enroll in a language school, or an internship, or doing research, or have. Like, as long as there's a language component, that we'll fund it, basically. And the two ways that it really comes into play as an undergraduate. Remember how I said if you hit 25 weeks, you get $25,000, if you get 24 weeks, you get $12,500. So say you're doing a affiliated program with FSU and the program is like 18 weeks. You're like, well, I want to stay for an extra 2 months and get myself from that over that like threshold to get $25,000. So I'm going to go on a language school for 4 or 8 weeks after my official program ends. That can be funded by Boren. You wouldn't necessarily get credit for it. We'll get credit for the official program, but it gets you to that 25-week threshold, that $25,000. One thing that we hate to see is people apply for a program that's like 24 weeks and 3 days. Do you want to add a week to your program? You can do private tutoring and you get twice as much funding. Usually they say yes. Not always, usually. So that's where it can really come in handy at the undergraduate level. At the graduate level, it comes in handy because, you know, as an undergraduate, you're like, I want to study abroad X place. And they're like, here's a bajillion different options and different ways to do it. There's not nearly as many preset ways as for graduate students to study abroad. So that's why the fellowship can really come in handy for graduate students, because they can really piecemeal together a program that works best for like their language, the language level, the kind of progression they want to get. If they want to do research while they're abroad, if they want to do internship while they're abroad, all of that is funded, able to be funded by Boren, as long as language study is your primary thing. If you go to our website, you should get QR code here. There's not. So if you go to this one, if you go to this link right here, if you go to our website, just type in recent language programs. It'll have a whole list of all the countries and like different programs in each country that we formed every stage. Those countries or those language programs are not preferred, they're not affiliated, they're not vetted by Boren. It's just a place to start. You don't know where to start. What are the places to start? So, flagship language initiatives, or the FLEAs, is what I'm going to call them moving forward, because again, we've got a lot of very long words. So, for the most part, you are creating your own program, or you're doing your own program, or you're using Boren as a way to fund this program. That there exists. For a handful of languages, their programs run by, in conjunction with the University of Florida or the University of Wisconsin. And these are very intensive language programs that in which you really make incredible gains in your language. The first one is the African Flagship Language Initiative, or the African program. So if you're interested in studying French, Swahili, Akanfi, Wolof, or Zulu, this is a really excellent program for you. This is also French. This is where French is preferred. So if you try to study French and if you propose to study French in the Seychelles, it is not preferred in that part. Don't blame it. We had a student who did that. Don't blame them for trying, because he wouldn't want to study French in the Seychelles. But if you want French to be preferred, you study it through the Afro program that I call. With these programs, again, they're fully funded. They include a domestic program at the University of Florida, and then for Senegal and Tanzania, an official program in those two countries. They're both run by the University of Florida. They're extremely intensive program. I mentioned earlier, it's like you're taking like 50, 60 hours a week. Again, that's like a gold standard. Super intensive, you stay in the homestay, you do a language pledge, you get a transfer from, University of Florida, so transfer is really easy. And you make, they're not for everybody, but they are really intensive programs where you can make incredible gains in language. You also have the option for Akmanti, Wolof, and Zulu. There's these three languages. You do the domestic summer program at the University of Florida. There's not an official fall program, so you would have to find your own program to go on for that. The other option for the fleas is deeply. That's for East Asian languages. It's for Thai, Indonesian, and Vietnamese. Thai, Indonesian, and Vietnamese. You do the domestic summer program at the University of Wisconsin, and then you do your overseas program at Indonesia, Thailand, or Vietnam. Similar to the athlete, again, we talk about 60 contact hours a week. We get a transcript from the University of Wisconsin, stay at home, you do a language club. Again, like these are incredibly intensive programs that are not for everybody. But if you are interested in one of those languages and you really want to, make incredible gains in your language, these are great options. And you don't have to, and with these programs, you don't have to figure out what you're doing. But if you apply for this with Boren, and you get the Boren, you're in, basically. So a lot of paperwork, but do that for whatever. Last is this Master's of Professional Studies. If you happen to know anyone who is very advanced at Persian, you can do a year-long master's program at the University of Maryland and get very good Persian and get a master's degree. But doesn't apply to that. Okay. All right, so these are the different elements to the application. It's like a lot of other applications. The biggest thing are the 2 essays. Transcripts, you have to, letters of recommendation, the study plan summary. I mentioned earlier, for most of you guys, most of the people who apply are creating their own program, so they're telling us what they're doing. And so that's what the study plan summary. They're telling us where you're wanting to go, how you're going to study there, and that's where you kind of play up the intensity of how much the program. But the meat of the application are the 2 essays. The first essay is your national security argument. The second essay is kind of a mishmash where you talk about how you prepared for your overseas study. And you also talk about what you want to do for the event. I mentioned that there's that service requirement, so we talk about how you want to fulfill that service. To go into more detail, let's talk about U.S. national security. So I've said U.S. national security a bunch throughout the presentation. I also mentioned that, again, they've chosen these countries because they're critical to U.S. national security. Your goal as part of the first essay is you need to explain the importance and the relevance of why you need to go to this country to study this language and why it's critical and important to U.S. national security. We don't define national security. So what you want to do is you want to make your national security argument based on what you studied, like what your academic history is, your classes of take, what your major is, and also what you'd like to do within the federal government. So for instance, if you are wanting to study Mandarin in Taiwan, and you are an oceanography major, you don't want to talk about superconductors, even though if you look up Google national security in Taiwan, we'll talk about superconductors. If you're an engineer and build superconductors, by all means talk about it. But if you're not, say you're an oceanography major, we're going to get to things that completely make me up, so bear with me. Say you're looking into creating waterways to create stronger shipping channels and cleaning up water. And Taiwan does a really good job of that and has a really important partner of the US in that region, blah, blah, blah. That's the argument. That's the tactic you want to take to create your craft your national security. You also want to talk, you're coming up with your national security argument and what based it on your background. You also want to think about Boren's priority So Boren has tier 1 agencies. Tier 1 is only what Boren called it, so don't. I was talking to someone else, like, so how does the government call tier 2? I was like, this is how important categorized, but no worries. But the tier 1 agencies are the Departments of Defense, State, Homeland Security, as well as those are kind of like obvious national security like arenas. And so when you're writing your application, you're talking about your national security argument, you kind of want to tie that together with both your background and like those specific agencies. For language and culture, that's the other big pillar of Boren. And that's when you're talking, again, I mentioned earlier with your study plan summary. Again, for those of you who are not doing the athlete of the C-FLE program, you want to put your best forward as you write your application. I'm going to study language, I'm going to do super intensely, take intensive language Arabic class, I'm also going to pay to have a private tutor who teach me every, 2 hours every week on top of my classes, et cetera. Again, your minimum is 15 to 20 contact hours per week. Gold standard is about 60 contact hours per week. Again, to clarify, these aren't like academic contact hours. You can't get 60 academic contact hours per week. I don't think weeks long enough. But what that means is you're taking classes like in the morning and the afternoon, you're meeting with language partners, speaking like 2 or 3 hours. You're doing like excursions where the tour guide is speaking to the language, you're taking a homestay, things like that. So it's not all classroom work. Because language is looking at so, but you want to kind of focus on it. You also want to talk about like having what your proficient, like what you expect to, how you expect to progress in your language. And you want to set realistic expectations for the proficiency. Again, you may be a true beginner, that's great. You don't want to say, I'm going to go to Poland as a true beginner and come out after you're being low advanced. That seems unrealistic. Maybe it's not, but it is. For most people. So again, with all of this, you want to make sure you don't sound like a crazy person. And you're using things like measurable, achievable goals that you know that you want to stretch yourself, but do it. This QR code is what I was looking for earlier. That is also the list of recent programs that I mentioned earlier. All right, so the second essay, talk about national security. Second essay, as I mentioned, so Boren Awards alumni commit to working for the U.S. government for at least a year after you graduate. Our preference is for students who are interested in long-term government work, a long-term career. So part of the second essay is both how you want to fulfill your service and also what you want to do in the government as a long-term goal. The requirement's just a year, so that's all you have to do when filling out the application. Don't say it, right? If you take a job, if you have a job where you're like, I just want to get enough money to pay for my car and I don't leave, you don't want help. And also, in a more altruistic way, like you're going to go abroad for a year, it's a life-changing experience, but you think you're going to be a different person is going to come back than the person who wrote this application. But well, right in this application, you definitely want to talk about your long-term career goals with the federal government. Because again, what Boren is because we have that service requirement, it's a real good pathway into the federal government. And so what you want to do as part of your application for the second essay, you go here, also that QR code. It'll show you where students have or Borens have fulfilled service within the tier 1 agency. What we are looking for is, again, we're looking for how you want to fulfill your service and also what you want to do for a long-term career. So we're looking for kind of realistic, short, medium, and long-term goals. So one thing that happens, a lot of students will do, especially at the scholarship level, is they'll say something like, I want to fulfill my service by being an FSO, foreign service officer. You have to fulfill your service within a few years after you graduate. That seems unrealistic that you're going to fulfill your service requirements by being an FSO. However, it's an excellent long-term career. I was just mentioning it to everyone here. We recently had to send out email blasts to all the embassies, and we had grantees. We currently have grantees. And we got so many FSOs who worked at those embassies and email us back to be like, oh, Boren, I was Boren, changed my life, so glad to hear from you, blah, blah. So being an FSO is not only an admirable career goal, it's a very realistic career goal, but it's just not realistic for your service. And so that's kind of the like short term versus long term understanding. I've mentioned these are the tier 1 agencies. In order to fulfill service, you can either work for one of these agencies or any contract work. Like I work for IAE, but we're contracted by the Department of Defense. So what I do, I'm technically not an employee, I'm a government contractor. You serve in the Armed Bureau of Contract Commission, as I mentioned earlier. We're serving in the Armed Services Council, or Council's everything is tier 1. Everything within those 4 agencies is tier 1. The official line is that everything else in the government is considered tier 2. As long as you have a job that has a national security focus and national security. Similar to the essay, essay 1, or how you define what national security is based on what your goals are. It's the same thing as far as like you fulfilling service. So if you fulfill service within the Department of Energy and you're like, I'm a chemical engineer and I'm doing research on nuclear, how to create a nuclear weapon. That's actually accurate. But again, that's in the national security, it's keeping US borders safe, et cetera. A better example is like, say, if you work for the Department of Agriculture, I work with farmers to help with soil erosion, so we can have crops to keep our US population fed. Farmers, but it's also, again, keeping US population fed, that's true. Much better example. But again, for the application, this is again part of that research that we want to do, and what all the different things you can do with the government. Because right now we're really kind of focusing on tier 1. There's a lot of overlap. A lot of things that jobs in the Department of Energy, they do similar things in the Department of Defense, the Department of State, or Homeland Security. There's a lot of overlap. So when filling out your application, if you know that you want to work for the Department of Energy long term, and you know that when we're works for the department is doing X with the Department of Energy, you're going to get jobs like A, B, and C. That's going to give you the experience to do X. If there are similar jobs to A, B, and C within one of the tier 1 agencies, talk about that in your application. Because again, there's 2 things that you are thinking about. You're thinking about how you want to fulfill your application. When you're doing your application, you are wanting to match yourself as closely as possible to Boren's ideal, which is different than what you actually end up doing 3, 4, or 5 years down the line, or as your career. One of the reasons earlier when we talked about eligibility, we always talk about how we want students who are interested in public service, federal work, etc. The reason being is because we do have that service requirement. We don't hand you a job, unfortunately. That said, we do want people to be able to fulfill the service requirement. We want good people in the government. So we do give you a lot of support to be able to find that job. One of the biggest things that we do is the entire time you have your service requirement outstanding, you get special hiring authorities, which basically means you get to skip a lot of steps in the hiring process. So, like I am not eligible for certain jobs with the government, because they're only looking for people who already work for the government or already have experience. I wouldn't qualify for that. People with these hiring authorities would, because it's like the equivalent of either years experience or the equivalent of already being an internal candidate versus the candidate. We also maintain, the Inside Service team also maintains a special job board. So all jobs available at the government is listed on USA Jobs. NZNet specifically, you have access to it when you still have a service agreement outstanding. That'll list jobs that are some sometimes the jobs are only eligible for Borens, because like, one of the things the service team does is they reach out to different departments in the government to tell them about these awesome people who just have this incredible experience and these incredible skills and governments, they're like, awesome, well, who would job Boren ones? Or it'll be open to people, only people who have the special hiring authorities, things like that. They will also do like resume consulting. If you give them enough time, they'll do mock interviews with you. Every year we hold a federal employment seminar. So after you return from your awards in the fall, we've been in DC for 2 days for a big conference. The first conference is just a bunch of information sessions, just a bunch of information sessions that are super helpful, like how to navigate your security clearance. We also have board alums who come and they talk about how they fulfill their service and where they are now, if they're still with the government. Maybe they're contractors, maybe they're in the private sector. But again, it's a good way to like see what people do. You know, I think a lot of times that's part of the thing when trying to find a job is just to like, what do people do? You know, and what do they do next? So it's a great way to kind of eliminate that. You become part of just, you know, the big network of Boren alums, of NSEP alums. The federal seminar, so again, you have all those sessions, the second day, the big hiring fair, the federal career fair, where a bunch of agencies come and they say, what I do, here are the jobs that we're looking for. So that's really the great way to, the great and exciting way to kind of kickstart your job search. So what I like to think about Boren, when I'm talking to people in a nutshell, is like Boren gives you money to go abroad to study a language, and then after you graduate, it helps you find a job. Again, it doesn't help you, it doesn't pay you the job, so part of people who are interested in that arena, they do give you, they give you a huge lift, and it's a great pathway. All right, so here's the timeline. The application is open now. We have one application cycle a year. Our application deadline is at the end of January. January 2026 is this cycle. That means if you want to go abroad in summer 2026, fall 2026, or spring 2027, the application deadline is in January. Now is the time to think about it. If you're going to go abroad at the end of the semester, as I said, you want to talk to your campus reps who are here. You can also contact us. We're a relatively small program, which means that like we're really accessible. You can set up 15-minute Zoom sessions. You can set up anything you want. We can't read your essays. Your campus reps can, but we can like give out ideas off, etc. You have to submit by the application deadline. You can go through the selection process. We notify you whether you receive the award by mid to late April. I had mentioned seminar, we send you guys to DC. There's also convocation, very fancy words for that, a pre-departure orientation, where again, we send you to DC for 2 days, and we do a bunch of pre-departure orientation information, a bunch of briefings and stuff, and more, and then the board we get to do. And then the early, and it is mandatory, so you have to go to DC. You pay for it. And it doesn't come from the $25,000 reward, but you do have to go. And then the earliest you can leave is, I think this year is June 5th. And then you have to leave before March 1st. Good. One thing I forgot to mention earlier. So I mentioned that we spent a lot of time talking about service requirement and how to fulfill it. So the official timeline for fulfilling the service requirement is for scholars, you have 3 years after you graduate to start fulfilling that requirement. For fellows, it's 2 years after you graduate to start fulfilling service requirement. That said, there's a lot of things that like stop the clock. So say, you know, you're right there for me, so I think we can't. There's a lot of things that stop the clock. So let's say I've done my board, I've come back, I graduate in May. That's when my clock will start. I decide I'm going to go to grad school in the fall, the clock pauses. And it pauses until I finish grad school 2, 3, 4 years later, how long it takes. That starts again, so I'm going to get my PhD. So that's going to stop for my next 8 years of what have you. You get a Fulbright, it also stops the clock. You do Peace Corps, it'll stop the clock, but also ultimately count for service. You also get 2 years of like no questions asked deferment, I think leave as well. Oftentimes people will start fulfilling their service like 5-10 years after they actually. So it just kind of depends on what. Again, it's the pathway into the government, and again, what's the most qualified and skilled people as possible. And like, when they go back to school, they're not gonna finish. Oh, they make it. So, anyways, here are the application deadlines. Here's our contact information. Again, my name is Sarah. I've thrown a ton of information at you. Are there any questions?